So you, if you're like me, can recall a time when you felt set free. Now, one that comes to mind for me this week, this is going to be part of your getting to know me a little bit. Those of you who have been to meet and greets have heard already part of my story that I went to college first thinking I was going to go into engineering, and that turned out not to be the way things ended up. And one of the stories from that time was the third semester when I flunked out. I went in to take my calculus final and sat down, and the final was 15 individual pages of paper stapled together, each page with a different problem on it. I was able to complete the first problem and part of the next problem and part of maybe 2 or 3 other problems. And this was a 3-hour test, and I was about a half hour into it at that point. And there was no more that I was going to be able to do. So I figured I had 2 choices. I could either sit there and agonize for the next 2.5 hours, or I could just turn it in and go get some frozen yogurt. It was very freeing to turn it in and go get some frozen yogurt that day. And I shifted from engineering over into public policy after that semester. But I was set free. Some of you know how this feels in other areas of life. You may play a musical instrument, and you may have, in the process of learning that instrument, run into roadblocks. And when you overcome a roadblock, a technique, or a particular way of fingering a note or a chord, maybe it was a relationship that you had in your life that was just stuck, and you figured out in the course of that relationship how to get it going again, and you were set free. Maybe at some point in your life when you needed it the most, somebody came through with a financial gift when you were feeling locked down, and it set you free. You probably have your own story. It's quite a feeling when something has been holding you back, and then that thing is cut loose, and you're able to move again, live again. In the reading we heard from Jeremiah today, we heard about age being his roadblock that God then swept out of the way. We've got another story today, a story from Luke's gospel about such a moment. Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. A woman was there who had been disabled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and couldn't stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, Jesus called her to him and said, "Woman, you are set free from your sickness." He placed his hands on her, and she straightened up at once and praised God. The synagogue leader, incensed that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, responded, "There are 6 days during which work is permitted. Come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord replied, "Hypocrites, don't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or your donkey from its stall and lead it out to get a drink? Then isn't it necessary that this woman, a daughter of Abraham, bound by Satan for 18 long years, be set free from her bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said these things, all his opponents were put to shame, but all those in the crowd rejoiced at all the extraordinary things he was doing. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. So, some years ago, a clergy colleague of mine told me a story from his ministry, and started out pretty familiar. For us pastors to go to the grocery store can be work sometimes. We often run into you at the grocery store, and we get to have a conversation, which we always love, of course. They always, well, not always, often. David gets it too. Often, they begin with apologies. Oh, I'm so sorry I wasn't in church on Sunday. We had this going on, or that going on, or that going on, and then it would continue. Well, on this particular day, my friend ran into this parishioner, and she gave the obligatory apologies, and then she started talking about where they'd been, that they were at the soccer field on Saturday, and it's just so important for their kids to get out there, the socialization and the physical exercise and learning a skill and all the things that they're getting out of that, and it's just so important, and they'll be back when the season's over. And my friend, this was early on in his career, was not very charitable in his response. He let her have it. Said, yeah, soccer's great, but what is really going to last your child? That soccer game or a relationship with God? When I was traveling around for these last 6 years as a district superintendent, I would stop at churches and had dozens of these meetings with groups of folks in churches and fellowship halls, and often a version of that conversation would happen in those meetings, and they would bring up, and generally, I'll just be honest, generally it's a group of older folks in the room who are not at all happy that the young parents in their town, whether their town is 250 or 250,000, whether the young parents in their town they're taking them to soccer, they're taking them to sports, and they're taking them to all kinds of other stuff, but they're not getting them to church. That wouldn't have happened when we were young parents. We always had our kids in church with us. In all of these interactions, I can hear this synagogue leader that we hear today. Let's call him Synagogue Dude today. I can hear him in the background. And I feel for this guy, just like I feel for all the folks in those conversations. I mean, he's not even talking to Jesus, so he's feeling entirely out of his depth in this situation that he finds himself in. The woman stands straight up for the first time in nearly 2 decades, praising God for the miracle, and he can't help but give her a hard time about it. What do you have to come here for to get healed on this day of all days? There are 6 other days in the week that you can get healed on. Come on one of those days. And you can just kind of imagine this poor guy that he just happened to be signed up on this day to be the synagogue leader on the sign-up sheet. And how many other people in the room were thinking, geez, I'm glad it wasn't me today. But here he is. And here's Jesus. And here's this woman. The story says that she'd been disabled by a spirit for these 18 years, probably well over half of her life, given lifespans back then. And it wasn't of her own doing. The Satan, the adversary, the story says, had a hold of her and would not let her go. But Jesus was having none of that on this particular Sabbath. As far as he was concerned, it was time to set her free. It was time for her to be saved, if you will. Now, synagogue dude had always heard it said that you were not supposed to work on the Sabbath. So he spoke up, as a good synagogue dude would. But as usual, Jesus knows his Torah pretty well. And he points out that, if you are allowed to water the livestock, to untie your ox or your donkey, and to get them to water on the Sabbath, then how is it that this dear woman can't be untied to rise up as a beloved child of God on this day of all days? Imagine what it would have been like to have been set free of that spirit, to have always been staring at the ground, bent over, straining to look up into the faces of all your neighbors, even the kids, probably. And then, voila, you stand up straight, free at last. The writer of Luke's gospel draws heavily on the Exodus story as a model for the story that he is telling about this Messiah, this Jesus. And it's not surprising. After all, the Exodus saga is the foundational narrative in the history of Israel, where they are freed from oppression and bondage at the hands of Pharaoh. And the story of this woman is sort of a miniature representation of what God did for Israel in big scale so many years ago. And it's also a representation of what God can do for all of God's people again if they'll just let Jesus cook. So, synagogue dude's buddies were ashamed, and the rest of the people who were gathered there that day were amazed and ecstatic at what he was doing. Now, some of you may not have had that calculus class, but you may have had Philosophy 101, and you may remember the difference between deontology and teleology in your philosophy class. Deontological morality is where you're thinking about following the rules, that there are duties and obligations that you need to follow. An example of thinking about morality in this way, in this deontological way, is to say that lying is always wrong. Lying is always wrong. Some of you in your heads are going, well, of course. And some of you are thinking, well, yeah, but. If that latter one is you are probably more of a teleological thinker, where you're thinking about morality in terms of its consequences. What are the consequences of our actions? How do things end up? What are the outcomes? So in this case, you may be kind of a Jean Valjean Les Mis person, where it's okay to steal to feed your starving family. The outcome is what you're going for. Javert is hounding you with the deontological way of looking at life. Now, both of these have their merits, right? Another story from my life, when I took some time away from ministry, a couple of those years I spent working in a community corrections facility. And really good work, wonderful opportunity to work with all of those men and women there. But what I discovered in those couple of years was that I really am much more of a shades of gray teleological thinker. And in a corrections facility, you cannot afford to do a lot of shades of gray teleological thinking. The rules mean something in a place like that. You couldn't have food in the dorms, which makes a lot of sense unless you're living in a facility where there's a dining room where you can only eat it 3 times during the day, and you get off work and you get home on the shuttle bus after everything's closed. You might want some granola bars in your locker. Or maybe you have more electronics that you want to have plugged in around your bunk than are allowed. But there's only so much power to be had. Just way too many shades of gray. Sorting out when all the rules are vitally important to follow over against when a situation requires more nuance can be a pretty challenging task for us. One of the concepts that I became more aware of in the last 2 or 3 years was the idea of intent. Excuse me. Intent versus impact. We may intend for certain things to happen or not happen, but our intention doesn't necessarily result in the impact that we want. Things may turn out differently than we intended. Like, you get excited and you bake a cake for somebody for their birthday or for a special occasion, and you get there and you find out that they have celiac disease. And you didn't know that. And now they're not going to be able to enjoy this great cake because it'll make them really sick. That's not the impact you wanted. Certainly doesn't match the intent that you had. Or what if you bring a great bouquet of flowers to somebody thinking they're just going to love it, and then you discover right away as they start sneezing their head off that they're allergic? That wasn't your intention. Sure was the impact. Figuring out the shades of gray, the different ways that things play out in life. In this story, we get the Sabbath showing up again, and this happens in more than one place in our scriptures, doesn't it? That the Sabbath that was initially created by God to be a day where you're reminded of life and what brings life to you and to your people, comes out of that Exodus story from Egypt, comes out of the creation story from Genesis. The Sabbath is intended to make space for life. The law that comes out of the Exodus is intended to make this space. So were the hundreds of rules that came out of those 10 commandments that started it all off. But the impact, as we find in this story today, turned out to be that life got stifled, not freed. What do you do with that? Back in the days of Egypt, there were tight boundaries and oppression that were holding Israel back. And God saw fit to break those boundaries, to let them loose. Luke here is showing us an example this morning of a time much later when the people of Israel are held captive in a different sort of way, aren't they? different kind of chains. They're bound up so tightly by the rules that have been piled on to them over time that they have lost sight of the life that God meant for them to have in the first place. So let's go back to that grocery store aisle and my friend with his parishioner. Now, he was telling me this story years later, and he regretted mightily how he'd interacted with that young mother in the grocery store aisle. I said, well, how would you do it now? He said, well, now I would recognize all of the pressures and the burdens and the cares that are placed on a young mom trying to raise kids today in a very different world than my parents tried to raise me. How could I pay attention to all of those pressures and stresses that are on her? Maybe I could say something more like, okay, we would love to see you when the season's over. Come on back. And let's talk more about how your kids can get involved in the church, how you can get involved in the church, how we can help you parent in these tough times. Or maybe we go back to one of those fellowship halls with me sitting there with all those folks who are so caught up, frustrated that those young families aren't showing up in their church, they're showing up in other places. What if I would say to them, by the time I got done with that job, what if we took stock of what it looks like to them? What does the town look like to all those folks who are not in church on Sunday morning? What does it look like when all the Christians in town pile up and go inside their church buildings on Sunday morning and get away from us? What might it look like if we considered getting out of the church building on Sunday morning when everybody else is free and doing their thing? What if we showed up there just to love on them? What would that look like to all those folks who are not church folks in our community? What if we in the church set our sights on being the place where people are set free? What if this was seen as the place where instead of finding judgment and complaining, you were invited to experience joy? What if we were seen by all those folks we encounter in the world during the week as the ones who set people free? The ones who are able to show them the way to light and life. That is the kind of impact that Jesus had everywhere that he went. That's the kind of crowd he left behind him everywhere he went. What if we made that so everywhere we go?